we can, one way to frame it is that it's an adventure, right? It's an exploration, and it makes life more interesting, richer, less boring, like a lot more exciting. And so how we frame this journey that is uncomfortable helps us lean into that discomfort. And also, I think progress over perfection, right? I mean, this can also feel overwhelming if, oh my gosh, I'm always going to need to be changing and what I did in the past is not going to work. Like that can feel overwhelming. But if we focus on progress rather than perfection, because perfection is a fixed mindset idea. Perfection is the idea that we can't improve further, but we can always improve further, right? That's a growth mindset. And so progress over perfection can help us, I think, lean into discomfort as well.
Eduardo, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider Podcast. Delighted and thrilled to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here with you, Brendan. Thank you for having me.
You're very, very welcome. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We've been chatting off the air. You know, our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So, Eduardo, what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
To me, first, purpose is very important to me. It feels like when we do what we do at work and outside of work for a higher reason, a higher purpose, with some consciousness around how we want to make an impact in the world, then it's just more fulfilling. Life is richer and more fun. And and then scaling, to me, it's if we want to grow in our impact, then growing is something to think about and to work toward. And that's a direction that we can go in terms of making, an impact and mattering, right? As we live and being a good steward of our lives. That said, I think there's a caveat, which is sometimes scale and growth sometimes creates unintended consequences in harming some of the purpose. And so I think scaling with purpose also involves like being conscious about how our actions are impacting others and then doing it in ways that we minimize the damage and increase the benefit.
Here. I love that. And you're certainly scaling your impact. I first came across your work when I found and came across your wonderful TED Talk quite a number of years ago, 5 million views now. And you cite the work of quite a high profile lady now. And this ties into something that you mentioned right at the outset of your book. For those who are listening, you won't be able to see Eduardo's book that I'm holding up here, The Performance Paradox, and I encourage you all to go out and grab a copy. But interestingly, right at the outset of the book, you said not getting into Stanford Business School when you first applied was the best thing that could have happened because it led to building a long-lasting relationship that has really changed the trajectory of your life. Can you share with our listeners a little bit of background and context to that?
Sure, yeah. I had spent 2 years working in investment banking in New York and 5 years working in venture capital in Silicon Valley. And I realized that the work that I was doing was not creating a sense of meaning to me. I wasn't feeling like it had a purpose because there was so much capital in the industry that I felt the great companies were going to be funded with or without me. And so, I didn't feel like I was mattering. And so I wanted to pivot and to do something that to try to find a different career path and build a different career path where I could feel like the work I was doing was making a difference. And so I applied down the road to Stanford. My wife had a job. We were happy in the area. And Stanford was an amazing, university with a great kind of social entrepreneurship program. And I really wanted to get in. I didn't get in. And of course, I was disappointed, but I applied again 2 years later and I got in. And the reason that was a blessing at the end was that if I had gotten in the first time, I wouldn't have met my dear mentor, Carol Dweck, Stanford professor, that I then partnered with. I started a company with called Mindset Works, and it really, because of her and her work and my partnership with her, it has. I took the path that I took, and I'm doing the work that I do now. And there's been a couple of points in my career where I've been really disappointed or going through a very difficult time around something that I thought was very negative. And looking back, it actually turned out to be really positive. So I've been very lucky in that way. And that was one example.
Yeah, fantastic. I haven't had the opportunity to host Carol on the podcast yet. So just before we move on to your incredible book, listeners to the show will be familiar with Carol Dweck's work and the concept of growth and fixed mindset. But I think it's spoken about so much now that people kind of go, yeah, we know what that is, but like, let's get on to the kind of the real meat and veg of scaling a business here. I think almost it's so foundational that we now tend to skip over it. Can you just, for the benefit of our listeners and for me, refresh what fixed and growth mindsets are? Because ultimately, a growth mindset is critical to actually scaling success.
Absolutely. And this relates to the first principle of simple scaling, right, of Psyche.
Thank you.
But when we ask people who are familiar with growth mindset, kind of what does growth mindset mean? What does it mean in your words? We hear lots of things like being open-minded or positive thinking or working hard or persevering. And a growth mindset is none of these things. So I'm glad you're asking this question. There is a lot of confusion. But growth mindset has become a buzzword and it's easy to distort. And so a growth mindset is a perspective about the nature of human beings. These other things are not that. And specifically, is the belief that we can change, that our abilities and qualities are malleable and we can develop them over time. And a fixed mindset, it's the opposite, is when we think that we are fixed the way we are. So, for example, if we think that great leaders are great leaders because they're natural leaders, that would be an example of a fixed mindset, right? Or, a great salesperson was born to be a salesperson, and or, our strengths are set the way we are, and our weaknesses are set the way we are. We can't get better at our strengths or our weaknesses. Those are examples of a fixed mindset. And a growth mindset when we see ourselves as work in progress, which means that we can change and we need to be working on our own change.
Yeah. What would I identify in a person if I was speaking to them for the first time, which would suggest to me that they have a growth mindset?
Well, one indication would be if they are conscious of what they're working to improve in themselves and how they want to change. So is there something that they're working on to improve in themselves? That would be one indication. People in a growth mindset tend to be taking on challenges. They tend to get bored by doing the same thing over and over in the same way. They want to experiment. They want to go beyond what they already know. So they ask questions from a curiosity standpoint. They wonder where they might have incomplete understanding or misunderstanding. So they're interested in other people's perspectives and different views of the world. So they're always working to continue to grow. That is, and so for example, if they receive feedback, they might like reflect and listen and ask follow-up questions to better understand the feedback rather than in a fixed mindset, we tend to respond defensively, right? Um, and so, and in a there's a lot of psychological and psyche consequences, right? In a fixed mindset, we also tend to label people and see them as fixed and more as almost like caricatures. So, in a growth mindset, if we, for example, talk to somebody in a different political party or political philosophy, in a growth mindset, people are more curious about the nuances of what they believe, why they believe it, try to understand their logic versus in a fixed mindset, we tend to just get into a fight, right? And label them and just say they are evil and I'm just going to fight with them and not try to understand them better.
Yeah, it's it's so profound, and I'm glad I asked the question because you've actually shared with me a different some different language around growth mindset that, as you say, is typically cited in relation to having a growth mindset. So your work is marinated in certainly the growth mindset, fixed mindset concepts. I mentioned right at the outset the performance paradox. Just for our listeners who are not familiar with your work, what is the performance paradox?
Sure. The performance paradox is the counterintuitive reality that if we're always constantly performing, our performance suffers. And that's often what we're trying to do is we're working really hard, just trying to do things as best as we know how, trying to minimize mistakes. That's what performing is. And that keeps us stagnant because in order to improve our performance, we have to improve our abilities and our capabilities. And to do that, we have to do something very different than performing, which is we have to go beyond what we know. We have to try different things that might or might not work in experiments. We have to learn from people from different perspectives about things that we don't know or that we haven't mastered yet. And that's what I call engaging in the learning zone, which is leaping beyond the known. And that's different than engaging in the performance zone, which is doing what we know best and trying to minimize mistakes. And both of them are really, really important. The performance zone is how we get things done, is how we make an impact. But if we're always staying there, then we stagnate and we don't get better.
Yeah, you can see why it's a paradox. And especially for our SME leaders listening, where ultimately they're under a huge amount of pressure to perform in lots of different facets of their business. Surely when they find something that works, especially in the early stages of scaling up, beyond the startup phase, but in the early stages of scaling up, surely you want to, really lock into that and double down on that to continue to deliver results, on a repeatable, predictable basis. But what we're saying is that in some ways this could undo you. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there's definitely a balance and a tension between these two zones. I think of it as yin yang, if you can picture that. It is opposing but complementary forces that need to be in balance and in harmony, right? So we can over-index on the learning zone, and then we're not going to deliver and we're not going to grow. Or we can over-index on the performance zone. We're going to stay doing our best but not growing, right? And so we need definitely a balance between those two. And we might sometimes lean more toward the performance zone, sometimes more to the learning zone. So for example, if we have a big project coming up and we're on a tight time frame, we need to put all our resources and just executing to finish that project. It might be reasonable to just worry about performance and not so much about learning until we deliver that. But if we're always just doing that, then we're going to stagnate, right? And so, and there's definitely so much truth to what you said. Like, when we are in a kind of startups phase, we might be looking at what's a positive ROI unit model. And once we find that, then, especially in online businesses, you can just, ramp up your marketing and your investment and you can grow really quickly. And that's fantastic. But we need some slack to continue to do experiments and to continue to do better, like to continue to improve even if it's in small ways and in small experiments, right? And the great companies, whether they're huge or small and getting started, they continue to experiment. I mean, like Facebook, Netflix, like these companies have been so successful. They continue to Amazon, they continue to experiment to get even better. And so we have to integrate experimentation and learning zone systems into how we work so that they don't take a lot of time, but that we are always continuing to generate new insights and new strategies to continue to change and tweak things along the way. And as I said, short term, you can just focus on performance zone if you have to, but if you're only doing that all the time, you're going to get into trouble. And so I would say that um, there's you know we need a growth mindset, which is the belief that we can improve, but we also need to know how to improve and to systematize and habituate that. And that's to put the learning zone and the performance zone both into our habits and systems on how we work on a daily basis.
There's a couple of things I want to come to because you've talked about staying in the performance zone can ultimately lead to stagnation, and it can chronically impede performance longer term. Before I get into that, from a small and medium sized enterprise perspective, where resources are limited, so resources on the leader's time, where they're absolutely focused on performance, delivering performance, and getting to that point where performance is actually repeatable, predictable, and sustainable. In those early stages, how do we habituate the oscillation between kind of learning and back into performance? How do we integrate learning into our scaling journey, given the fact that resources are limited? We don't typically, in an SME scaling environment, we don't have spare capacity within our teams. We definitely don't have spare cash. We don't have extra time for kind of learning days. So how how can we get to a point where this is just what we do? And interestingly, I had Professor BJ Fogg, one of your colleagues at Stanford, who actually designed the created the behavior design lab in Stanford. So leaning on that, even, and a little nod back to that, how can we integrate this the learning piece here?
Yeah, so BJ's Fogg's work is great on tiny habits, and it is definitely about that, right? Tiny habits that are small, easy to do, but very, very frequent. So ideally, things that we can do every day. Um, and and so I'm not talking about taking courses or going to school or even doing workshops. That can be very helpful, but the biggest opportunity is in shifting how we work so that we're working in a way that's leading to both performance and learning. And that's what I call learning while doing. And and it doesn't have to take more time. It can take like a little bit more time in terms of reflecting. So for early stage businesses, it's I think it's important to do a little bit of reflection around what assumptions are we making, what hypotheses do we have that are things we might think we know, but we're not sure we know, right? So we need to really list what are our hypotheses and how can we look into those things? And it might be through a conversation with a prospect or a customer that we ask a couple different questions in that conversation, but being clear about what do we know and what do we think we know that we really need to validate, or what are we testing and experimenting with? And that can inform how you do the work, what questions you ask, what you try. Because in trying to scale, you're trying different things. You're trying different ways to approach a customer, or different ways to do marketing, or different messages in the marketing. Um, and so it's how do we do the work we need to do while being more curious and more mindful of what we're trying to find out along the way. And yeah, this idea of tiny habits definitely is something to think about. Like, for example, just reminding ourselves every morning of maybe what's one of those questions that I want to try to find out right now that I'm focused on. And maybe that can give you a little bit of an idea of what can I do today in what I need to do to get a little bit smarter about that question, right? And what starts happening is that if you build a tiny habit like that of reminding me every morning of what I'm looking to learn, then what starts to happen is that you start thinking differently throughout the day. You start being more curious. You start listening to things that the customer says that are different from the way you think. You start asking a little bit of different questions. You start paying attention to the mistakes or the things that happen differently from what you would have expected. And so as you're doing the work, you're paying attention to different things that are making you smarter along the way.
So can this be learning a new trait? Let's say being more patient, being more curious, seeking to listen more on sales calls, for example? Or is it typically competencies? I need to learn how to write code which will support our lead generation activities, or a mix of both?
It can be a mix of both. It can be one or the other, depending on what we're trying to do. When we are leading a business, we can, anybody in that business can choose to learn a new skill, for example, or, there might be the way that we collaborate. There might be if we're hiring people, like who we're bringing into the business. So different people can have different skills. As a leader, I don't need to learn how to code if somebody else is going to be doing the coding, or I might choose to do that so I can get a better understanding. So it's more like, how do we think about the business and the team and the competencies that the team needs, and how do we build them over time? And there might be different ways to do that. And depending on what we're working on, there are lots of different learning strategies that we might use.
Something that strikes me about this, and I've had lots of guests on that have spoken to this in different ways, is the real discomfort from leaning into something that is new. So we might have a sales script, let's say, and that sales script is proving very successful. So when I deliver that sales script, when I conduct the call in this way, actually, from a performance perspective, actually, the probability of it achieving results is very, very high. The question then becomes is why would I change that script? And the second part of that is it's going to be very uncomfortable for me to do that. So I'm curious to understand how we kind of overcome that discomfort, moving away from something that is proven to work to something that isn't, that I'm having to test, and deal with the discomfort of that.
Yeah, well, we don't need to change everything, and that would be ineffective. And if something is working, it might not be the thing to experiment with. We might want to experiment with something else. One way to think about it is you have we want to work on getting better at the highest level goals, which for a company, it might be kind of the strategy that we're pursuing, or the big, big goals. So if I say, for example, should I get better at the sales script? One question that I can ask myself is, why would I want to do that? Well, I want to do that because I want to sell more, or I want to sell to bigger customers, or because, whatever the answer is, then I can ask, why do I want to do that? Well, because, we have this strategic goal of reaching 20% of this segment of the market or whatever. And so then I can ask myself, well, so once we get to the highest level goal, I can ask myself, how can I get better at growing to reach this big part of the market, right? And the answer might be, well, let me try to get my sales script better. Or the answer might be, well, my sales script's working really well, but actually this other thing, I'm not sure that we're nailing this yet. Or maybe like, yeah, our marketing, I wonder if we could get bigger customers or prospects that can more quickly, more have a higher probability of turning into customers, or something else. But it might be the sales script. And if you're working on changing the sales script, and the sales script is working really well, because we can always improve, right? I mean, no matter how well something's working, we can always improve. But if you're going to experiment with changing it, there's going to be the risk that whatever you change it to is going to work worse, right? And so one way to experiment with that is to experiment in lower stakes situations. So maybe in situations with smaller customers, kind of less high stakes customers, or maybe with people that you have a lot of trust and a relationship with. So you could say, hey, like, how do you think that worked for you? Because usually I talk about this, but here I tried talking about this. Do you think that's a good idea? Like, did that work for you? Was that helpful? Um, and so in order to experiment, we need safety. We need the consequence of the experiment going wrong to not be very material, to not harm us very well. So that helps us, get the clarity of the experimentation.
So, kind of keeping the stakes lower, um, having the mindset of the intentionality just to experiment, just to test. Given that the stakes are lower, I suppose the discomfort level will be less. But have you any Have you any practical guidance about how we should deal with the discomfort, whenever that's rising, whether the heart rate's rising, the palms are getting sweaty, and
Yeah.
the little voice is saying, "Now's not the time. Let's default to the original situation here." Any
Yeah.
guidance on that, Eduardo?
Yeah, I think sometimes taking on challenges and trying different things can feel comfortable and often it can feel uncomfortable. And I have an example where, I want to get better at speaking Spanish, which is my first language. And my wife also speaks Spanish and she also wants to get better. So we want to speak Spanish to each other, but it feels uncomfortable to speak Spanish to each other because we can communicate better in English. And so we tend to gravitate toward English. And so I need to remind myself if I want to get better in Spanish, I have to feel uncomfortable in this like communication with my wife, which usually feels very comfortable. And it does involve some self-talk of like, I need to work on something that I want to do that is uncomfortable. Maybe that takes a little bit of pausing, a little bit of regular reminding so that we can lean into it. And one thing that I'm trying right now, and it's actually worked well, is one of the ways that I'm training myself for discomfort is I started taking like cold showers, which are good for the health anyway. Um, and one of the things that I do, because it was very hard at the beginning to get into this cold shower, was I'm training myself for discomfort. Like discomfort is something that I want more of in my life. And the more I do it, the easier it becomes. And then I'm finding that then the easier it becomes for me to lean into discomfort in other situations as well. But it's something that I'm still kind of experimenting with and trying to get better at.
I'm curious now because as a Wim Hof method instructor, I'm a big fan of cold exposure. So we had actually Wim on the podcast a number of months back. So huge fan of cold exposure. And in fact, we encourage those who participate in our own 12-month scaling program to actually embrace the discomfort of cold showers because ultimately it trains that resilience muscle. Yeah, I find the entire topic fascinating because we hear a lot from a lot of the leading consultancies out there about the importance of leaders becoming resilient, embracing discomfort, and organizations becoming more resilient, but they never share practically how you actually develop that resilience muscle. So it's comforting to hear, Eduardo, that you're embracing the cold showers. So I can share with you some tips off air, but yeah,
Great.
well done you.
Great.
It's
And I would say, like if somebody's struggling with engaging in what's uncomfortable or beyond or trying to change something, if you're struggling with that, then I would try to either break it down or make it a little bit less challenging, a little bit less beyond what you can do now, and see if that kind of same idea of tiny habits, if that kind of progress rather than perfection, this if I'm uncomfortable with this big experiment, can I be a little more into like a smaller experiment or something that's a little bit more proximal to what I can do.
Yeah, I like that. I like the framing as well of kind of this is a test. It doesn't have to be permanent. We're just going to test this and leaving the stakes quite low, such that the discomfort levels are lowered as a result, coupled with other practices, practical things like embracing the cold showers to develop that resilience muscle. We mentioned earlier chronic performance. Tell me a little bit more about chronic performance.
Sure, yeah. So chronic performance is when we're just always only engaging in the performance zone. And that keeps us stagnant. And one reason that happens, and you've nodded to this in this conversation, is we have a psychological bias as humans that is called the present bias, which is where we overvalue the present and immediate rewards, immediate gratification, and undervalue the future. We don't do this consciously. We just do this because that's how humans work. And often there's also systems in place that that accentuate this. And so we what's easier, more easy to measure is like what's immediate. And if for big companies in the public markets, they are pressured to maximize the immediate net income. And so then these big company leaders start pressuring their organizations to just focus on immediate short-term results, and that gets into the culture. People who work in big companies start companies, or they join your company, and then there's this focus on immediate execution and results, and that is at the detriment of long-term results, right? So when we think about how do we balance how do we think about the balance between the learning zone, the performance zone in our systems and our habits? Are we at the right balance? What we need to think about is, what is our highest level goal over the long term? And is the way that we're working now, what's going to get us to success over the long term? And that involves executing right now and delivering results right now, but it also involves engaging some learning zone and some experimentation so that we can grow and achieve our long-term results as well.
Yeah, the presence bias. I hadn't heard it termed like that before, but that makes so much sense. Is this why I think it was termed the marshmallow test, is so profound, where they conducted a study of kids years ago to assess the potential for them to be successful later on in life, and give them a little test and said, look, if you achieve this, you can have a marshmallow now, but if you wait for a little while, you can have two, sometime later. And those who waited for two later, ultimately, it was concluded that they were more successful in life, whatever success was defined at that point in time. Is this the same concept that we're speaking about?
Yeah, so people who are better at delaying gratification, um, are better at making investments, for future benefit. And some of those investments are learning investments, right? They are doing things in a way that is more mindful of the future rewards that you'll receive, and that leads to greater future rewards.
Yeah. Something that you mention in your book, which really struck me. I love this line, is that too often as leaders we're more focused on proving than improving. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So when we're a fixed mindset, we believing that people are set the way they are and we can't change and improve, then we tend to focus on proving that we are great and that we're talented rather than on improving. And so, for example, we tend to focus on what we know, and if we do make a mistake, we tend to disregard it to ourselves and to others and kind of like put it under the rug rather than examine it and talk about it so that we can figure out what can we learn from this mistake, and what can we change going forward so we can get better. Um, and so for leaders, it's important if they're interested in building a culture of learning in their organizations where they're performing and executing, but also they are learning and improving over time, not only improving the business, but improving us as in terms of our understanding, our knowledge, our skills. It's important for the leaders to model being learners themselves, being work in progress themselves. So to share what they're working to improve, and to ask questions, and to be curious, and to solicit feedback, and to do that explicitly and visibly, so that when other people observe those behaviors and emulate them, you get a bunch of learners who are working together and collaborating, not only to perform, but also to improve. And that makes the organization stronger.
Yeah, we suggest or assert that scaling organizations are a group of learn-it-alls, not a group of know-it-alls. So what I'm hearing so far, successful organizations, successful scaling organizations, are learning organizations, and those learning organizations are typically characterized by leaders who are long-term focused, leaders who encourage experimentation and they model experimentation themselves. They share with others the latest experiments or latest things that they're being challenged with, whether that's speaking Spanish at home, and the discomfort of all of that. But you're sharing the latest learning that you're leaning into, and you're in this constant state of wanting feedback with the desire to improve. What else characterizes a learning organization, and how else can we move from kind of an individual who's learning as a leader to ultimately creating teams that learn together, and ultimately creating a learning organization, which we know, or what we're hearing is characteristic of a successful scaling organization?
Sure. Well, so I think something that relates very much to scaling enterprises, organizations, is that part of the reason you need to be learning along the way is that as the organization grows, the way you lead needs to evolve, the way you structure the organization, like the organizational structure, often needs to change. The uh, what the leader of the organization might be more of an individual contributor very early on, and the role evolves until eventually it becomes, more than half of it is communicating to the people, and to the outside world. So the role shifts a lot, and so you need to be learning in part because the challenges, the internal challenges, need to be shifting and evolving over time. Aside from, you're trying to find product market fit, and so you're trying to figure out how the product needs to shift, how the messaging needs to shift. And the world is changing at the same time, right? So there's AI, and there's opportunities to use AI in different ways. And the politics might be impacting your business. And so everything is changing, and being a learning organization allows you to adapt to those changes, but also drive the change that you want to see in your customers, in the impact you want to have, and as well as internally. But what doesn't change is also important to be clear on. So your purpose, your mission, what that's something that might not change, and it's the reason that you do everything, right? Or you might identify some core values that are really important to you, like learning or growth mindset might be one of them. And so as we are going through a lot of change, another psychological need that we have as humans is the need to predict that we're going to be okay, and the need to predict how we can communicate with each other, interact with each other, and that if I do something, I need to be able to predict that Brendan is going to respond in a certain way. It's not going to do X or Y. It will be more like Z. And so we need to be clear around our norms, our values, how we communicate with each other, and why we're doing the work we're doing. What is the vision and the mission that we're pursuing? And that gives us the stability and the grounding to put in all this effort and resilience in both learning and performing.
Yeah, it's a great nod to our second principle, which is purpose and vision. And I always say you cannot over communicate your purpose and vision. And when an organization is going through lots of change, it's really important to actually communicate and continue to communicate why it feels so disruptive at the moment, because ultimately here's where we're going, folks, and this is why we're going there. This is why we're embracing this discomfort for a long-term vision. You mention again something else we talk about a lot is what got you to here won't get you to there, and this is certainly the case for startup founders, where they hustle for a period, they eventually arrive at product market fit, they're starting to commercialize what they've developed, and that can be very, very dangerous. Back to what got you to here won't get you to there. What got you from 0 to 1 won't get you from 1 to 10, doesn't get you from 10 to 25, doesn't go from 25 to 50. So it's this understanding that in the context of scaling, you should be very aware that synonymous with that what undergirds your scaling success is this desire to want to learn and develop and grow. Feedback is something you mentioned in order to support the leader to develop and grow. How best should we solicit feedback?
Yeah, so I think feedback is so critical. First, what you just said made me also think about um, this evolution that we are going on, right? That what got you here won't get you there, and it ties to discomfort is we can one way to frame it is that it's an adventure, right? It's an exploration, and it makes life more interesting, richer, less boring, like a lot more exciting. And so, how we frame this journey that is uncomfortable helps us lean into that discomfort. And also, I think progress over perfection, right? I mean, this can also feel overwhelming if, oh my gosh, I'm always going to need to be changing and what I did in the past is not going to work. Like that can feel overwhelming. But if we focus on progress rather than perfection, because perfection is a fixed mindset idea, perfection is the idea that we can't improve further, but we can always improve further, right? That's a growth mindset. And so progress over perfection can help us, I think, lean into discomfort as well. But with feedback, I do think feedback is the most important learning zone strategy in the workplace, whether it's feedback from our colleagues, feedback from our prospects and customers, partners. Um, and I think the most important thing, you nodded to it, is to solicit feedback and to do it frequently and often. Uh, Often when leaders want to create a culture of feedback, they tend to focus on helping people give feedback. They give a lot of feedback to people. They encourage people to give a lot of feedback. And that's not giving feedback's not a bad thing, but it's a lot more powerful and effective if you focus on soliciting feedback and encouraging everybody to solicit feedback. And you model the way by soliciting feedback frequently and broadly from the people that you lead. And that then when we solicit feedback, it makes it a lot easier for the person to receive the feedback, right? Because we're initiating it. So it gives us a sense of control and status, and we're ready to hear it when we're solicited. We also kind of solicit things around the things we're interested in learning more about. So it gives the other person also, it makes it a lot easier for the person to give feedback because often we're afraid to give feedback because the other person might react defensively. So I think give soliciting feedback, which is what you asked about, is the most important thing. Um, I think one thing that might make it hard to solicit feedback, especially early on in building a culture of learning, is sometimes people feel like if they solicit feedback, then other people will think that they are incompetent or not confident, right? They don't know what they're doing, and that's why they're asking because they're insecure. And it might be perceived that way. If I'm a leader and I start soliciting feedback, other people might say, well, like, is he not sure or is she not sure? And are we in trouble? Is this person not the right person to lead this organization? And so for that reason, we need to set the stage and help people first understand what kind of culture we're trying to build. What's the role of feedback? Why is feedback so important? And then just like very briefly remind people of that. Remember, we want to solicit a lot of feedback. I would love your feedback on this thing. And that then comes across as a sign of confidence rather than lack of confidence, right? Because it's confidence that if we learn from each other every day, this is the path to success. We're going to succeed, but in order to succeed, we need to act like learners every day. And this is what it looks like. Um, Other tips in terms of soliciting feedback, often being specific helps other people give you specific feedback. So, if I did a presentation, did I frame it in the right way or did I have the right kind of energy, like something specific about what you're looking to learn about. And I think the most important around soliciting feedback is often people say what you did well, and, oh, that was great, and they give you kind of general feedback and also very reinforcing feedback, which is not bad but not enough critical feedback, right? Because that feels uncomfortable. And so pushing people around, okay, that's great that it worked well for you, but what is one thing that I might rethink in terms of changing something or something that I might be unaware of that I did that I could have done better? And so just pushing people a little bit around, also giving some critical feedback that you can learn from.
Yeah, this resonates so strongly. I love, just to go back to what you said again, the importance of the frame that, we've one life. Treat this as an adventure. We're in this privileged position to be to be leading businesses, to be part of businesses, to serve customers, to serve others, to collaborate with people, to for scaling businesses, to travel to new countries, to meet new people. It's such a privilege if we can frame it each day as an adventure. I smile when you say that, because it's important, I feel, that we remind ourselves of that. Too often we get caught up in the results, the hard metrics, cash in bank, sales won, leads generated. It's we get caught up in those things, and those then start to inform whether the frame's good or bad, as opposed to us being very intentional at the start of every day about this being an adventure. And we're wonderfully privileged to be part of this adventure. I really, really love that. I'd love to get your feedback. Speaking of feedback, on something, a little model that we have developed to give feedback internally within our own team at Simple Scaling. And we encourage feedback from each team member. So once a month, we will meet with a different team member, and we give feedback both ways. And we do that on the basis of a 3-2-1 system. So 3 strengths that we recognize in the other person, 2 ways that we feel that those strengths could be leveraged for the betterment of the business in the context of the vision that we have all bought into, and 1 area where we feel the person could improve. What's your feedback on that feedback model?
Well, I generally like the idea. I in general, so as a separate idea, people ask me, like, should they work on their strengths or their weaknesses, to further improve their strengths or to improve their weaknesses. And I think it varies. It involves judgment, but it is good to become more self-aware about what we're doing well and what we are more kind of novices in, and then make judgment calls around what would be helpful for me to work on. And sometimes that will be strengths, sometimes that will be weaknesses. So I like the increased self-awareness around 3 strengths. I think that's wonderful to give the other person more awareness around what they're doing that's really helpful to the team and to the organization, because often we're doing things that we're doing well and we're not aware. So when we hear from other people, this thing that you do is really helpful, that increases our self-awareness, and then we can lean more into that. And I like the third question of what's one thing I can do better. Also, that's very growth minded. The second one, I was a little bit unclear. I like the question, but how can we better leverage those strengths for the business? I think I like that generally, but what it made me wonder is it uh, is there a conversation there around continuing to improve those strengths, or just kind of exploiting those strengths in the business, right? And I think both of those can be helpful parts of the conversation. But I think thinking about how do you continue to exploit these strengths, but also to continue to improve these strengths, is that something that you want to think about, or is that something that we should think about? Is something to just consider.
Thank you for that, because yeah, we tend to focus on how we can exploit those strengths as opposed to exploit and support each other in improving those strengths, recognizing that they're super valuable, they're the person's unique ability, and let's continue to amplify them, improve them, and then leverage them for the betterment and an alignment of the vision. So I really like that. Actually, it's something that I'm going to feed back to our team. So brilliant. Moving into our close, Eduardo, we as a as part of the podcast, each episode, we invite our guests to share with our audience 3 timeless takeaways. Given your incredible experience across different industries, and you've certainly gone on a personal journey, can you share with our audience 3 timeless takeaways?
Yeah, 3 takeaways. First, I would encourage people to think about what are you taking away? Because then when we generate, what am I taking away from this conversation? And we write it down and we come back to it. Then we reflect on it. We start making these new neural connections in our brain as we listen to this conversation. We might have had some insights, but these new neural connections are weak connections because they're new connections. And we tend to overestimate how much we'll remember something when we first learn it. We tend to think, well, now I know this thing and I'll always remember it. But actually, we need to put some effort into like coming back to it tomorrow and next week and next month for it to reinforce neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more that that's why the tiny habit of like remembering what I'm looking to improve every morning, that starts changing your brain and you start thinking differently. So I would encourage people to think about what am I taking away? What do I want to remember from this? But three things that I would highlight is one, if we're constantly performing, our performance suffers. That's the performance paradox. We need to think about how do we integrate and make both the learning zone and the performance zone part of our lives so that we can increase our skills and our capabilities and our performance and our impact over time. That's number one. Number two is we want to think about the way we work rather than like think about I need to take a course or I need to spend 2 hours learning. How do I little by little gradually changed my systems and my habits, systems like what's on my calendar, what's on our meeting agendas, what do we do when we meet with a customer and after we meet with a customer, what do we do in the middle of a project and at the end of the project? Those are systems. How can we continue to improve them so that they incorporate both learning, but both performing, but also learning? And then third, I would say is the importance of modeling learning, as leaders, especially, and in leading a culture that we want to have in our organizations consciously. How do I make those desired behaviors visible and explicit so that I'm leading the way in terms of the behaviors and I'm framing them and communicating and explaining why those behaviors are important, but then also showing them through my actions visibly and explicitly.
Yeah, I love those. Well, the last hour has flown. I've learned a lot today. You've performed exceptionally. So, what's next for you?
Well, I'll continue doing the work that I do that I love so much, which is I do a lot of keynotes and workshops at organizations that are looking to develop cultures of learning, growth mindset cultures. And so I will continue doing that work and working to get better at it. That's something that I love. And within that, there's a lot of things that I'm working on. And then aside from that, like outside of work, I have this long-term passion around catalyzing radical imagination. And that's an early stage project that I'm kind of tipping my toes in the water on and really excited about and learning about and kind of incubating.
I'm curious now. What do you mean catalyze, catalyzing radical imagination?
Well, when we think about continuous improvement, we often think about how do we make the present better, right? So, and that's great. And that's where I think we should spend most of our time on. But a different way to improve is to forget the present, suspend the present, suspend what's true, and think about longer term, what's a radically different future? What could possibly be with radical imagination? And then we can think about, is there something we can do to go toward that? And that's just a different way to problem solve and to ideate things we could do that lead to different solutions.
That's a topic that I'm hugely interested in as well. So whenever you've started to do a little bit more work on that front, I'd love to have you back on. Eduardo, if people want to hear more about your work, about your keynotes, your workshops, where best to connect with you?
Sure, I'm active on LinkedIn. My website is briceño.com. It's my last name.com. I have a monthly newsletter there if people want to continue learning about growth mindset and the learning zone. And I also have a free PDF there with 5 tips to build a growth mindset culture.
Brilliant. Well, look, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Eduardo, it's been an absolute pleasure to host you on ScaleX Insider today. I've really enjoyed listening to your your incredible insights in relation to learning organizations, all things performance. A great nod back to Psyche and your mentor, Carl Dweck, there, and everything that you do. Uh, I wish you every success in everything you're doing. I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Brendan.